Happy New Year, everyone. Also, Happy Christmas. It's always nice to remind ourselves that it's still Christmas. It doesn't finish last week. It's still going on. Lovely candles. But we are nearly at the end of the Christmas season. It's 12th night, Epiphany coming up. Depending on how you count it, somewhere around Tuesday or Wednesday this week. Apparently there's a bit of debate about when it all happens. But Epiphany's kind of cool because it's the traditional point, the end of the Christmas season. It's where we start to think about the coming of the Magi, or the wise men, or if you're inaccurate, the kings. And they come to the Nativity. And so it's appropriate that the reading that we just had, and thank you for that one, was Matthew's account of the Magi arriving. And today, what I really want to pick up on is one bit of that reading that, in one sense, is like a tiny and minor detail that isn't really that important in the context of the story, but in another sense, has kind of become the defining feature of this story. It's the bit that everyone knows the Magi for. It's the three gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Now, I don't think any of us here are Christmas novices. I think we've done Christmas before. And what happens is when you've done enough Christmases, you kind of know the drill with these gifts. You know that each gift has got a symbolic significance. It represents something. So gold, because Jesus is a king. And frankincense, because Jesus is a priest and holy. And myrrh, because Jesus is going to die. And because the third of the Magi was a bit of a pessimist. Now, you might also know that this isn't actually in the reading that we just had. You may have noticed that it just says gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And Matthew doesn't say gold, because Jesus is a king. That's not in there. It's kind of there for us to maybe speculate upon. And it's one of those things that has grown up traditionally, that we put certain values on these, but it's not in Matthew's gospel. Now, personally, I think it all comes down to the carol We Three Kings, because We Three Kings, which is not one of the happier Christmas carols. We used to go carol singing in old people's homes and rest homes and care homes, and we'd essentially throw it open and say, who wants us to sing what? And someone would always say We Three Kings, and it was like, yeah. Because it's a bit dirgy, isn't it? Let's be honest. But it has particular verses dedicated to each of the three gifts. There's one on gold and one on frankincense and one on myrrh. And in those verses, they say to us, this is the purpose of this gift. And part of me thinks that that's really where we've drawn this tradition from, is from that carol. And then I wonder how much we should rely on the theology of a carol that has two factual mistakes in the first three words. We Three Kings. So perhaps we need to go a little bit deeper. And the thing is, actually those markers, to say this is about king and priest and death, that is okay. There's nothing wrong with that. That does make perfect sense. Jesus is a king. He is a priest. He is going to die. Fair enough. I just think it's a bit too limited. It's reading too little into what the Magi are doing. You see, remember Matthew is Jewish. Matthew draws heavily on the Old Testament. He's got lots of prophecy. He knows his stuff in terms of Old Testament and prophecy and significance and meaning and all that kind of thing. So I think Matthew is potentially nudging us to go a little bit deeper than we often go. To go beyond king, priest, death, and see what else the Magi have to say to us. So we'll follow Matthew's order, because it's the order that we all know the gifts in, gold, frankincense, myrrh. We'll start with gold. And so the carol, We Three Kings, says, gold I bring to crown him again. Pretty clear. Okay, we're going with kingship. And it is true, Jesus is a king. But being a king is just a title. I mean, Israel alone has many kings. Some of them good. More of them not good. Some of them quite complicated in between somewhere. But just being a king is a thing. It's a title. It doesn't carry anything more than that. But if we take a step back and take ourselves to the book of Exodus, then we can perhaps draw out a little more. Because in Exodus, you get all these instructions for the construction, that's a terrible sentence, for the building of the tabernacle. And the tabernacle is like the tent version of the temple that's going to come later. And these instructions, I don't know if you've ever read them, they're not fascinating. Well, they are fascinating. They're not a good read because they're incredibly detailed. It's a really detailed set of instructions that God gives, saying, look, you're going to make it, it's going to be exactly these dimensions, made of exactly these things. The fabric is going to be exactly this colour. This is exactly what I want it to look like. And then you get it all again when they build it. And one of the things that you can notice is that different metals are associated with different areas of the tabernacle. So in the outer courtyard, where we have the great big altar of burning stuff, it's made of bronze. And all the utensils that are used on the great big altar of burning stuff, bronze. And the wash basin for washing your hands before using the altar of burning stuff, bronze. Everything in the outer courtyard is bronze, or is wood coated in bronze, which is bronze for our purposes. And then as you move to the tabernacle itself, the walls of the tabernacle are actually made of wood, but they're all in kind of footers, foundation, I'm not technical, bits at the bottom that the wood sits on. And these are made of silver. So the walls of the tabernacle rest on silver. And then once you go into the tabernacle, we change again to gold. Things in the tabernacle are made of gold. The lampstand is made of gold. The little altar of incense, that's made of gold. The Ark of the Covenant, gold. In fact, when Solomon builds the temple version of the tabernacle in Jerusalem, he lines the entire inside of the temple in gold. These things have meanings. Everything in the Bible has meanings, but there is some meaning here. Bronze links with judgment. The idea of the altar and outside and the toning is bronze. The silver, slightly flakier, but it's the idea of redemption. It's used in the Bible to redeem, you use it to pay for things, and the foundation of the tabernacle is redemption. I quite like that one. And then gold is holiness. Gold symbolizes holiness. Now, as you can tell, given my description of silver bits as the bit at the bottom, I'm not really entirely clued up on this. I'm not a chemist, I'm not a metallurgist, so forgive me if you are and I'm wrong on this, but my understanding of gold is that it's basically an inert metal. It doesn't do... Oh, someone's nodding. Excellent. It's right. Gold is inert. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't really react with other metals. It doesn't make alloys, particularly with other metals. It doesn't tarnish. Most metals, if you leave them out, they will rust, or they will corrode, or they will tarnish. And gold doesn't. It remains pure. In fact, it's interesting. One of the interesting things about gold is that it is both the first metal mentioned in the Bible and the last metal mentioned in the Bible. I did not know that until this week. If you go back to Genesis chapter 2, verse 11, it's the only metal mentioned before the fall of man. That bit where it talks about the 4 rivers that run around Eden, one of them arises in the land of Havilah, I think it is, and there is gold. It's the only time we get metal mentioned before the fall. And then right at the end, in Revelation 21:21, we discover that the streets of Jerusalem, the New Jerusalem, the holy city of God, are paved with gold. Incredibly pure gold. See, gold is there before sin, and gold is there after sin. And I don't want to read tons into that, but I think it's allowable to say gold is connected in some way with holiness. How do we symbolize the holiness of the city of God? The streets are made of gold, because gold is pure. Gold symbolizes holiness. And so this first gift of the Magi, it does tell us that Jesus is a king, but it tells us that he's not just a king. He is the king. He is the King of kings. And why is that? It's because he is holy. He is pure. He is set apart to rule. His kingship doesn't arise out of power. It comes out of his holy nature. So then the second gift is frankincense. And in our carol, incense owns a deity nigh. One of those catchy phrases that's difficult to understand. Something about a god being nearby. See, frankincense, in order to understand frankincense, it's another one where we need to go back to the tabernacle. You see, part of the holy furniture, the gold furniture, thus the holiest of the furniture, within the tabernacle is this smaller altar. When we think of the altar, we normally think of the big one outside for burning cows and stuff, but there's a smaller one in the tabernacle for burning incense. In fact, it burns a unique incense that the Bible says you can only make this to burn on this altar, do not burn it anywhere else, which is annoying because I really want to know what it smells like. So that sort of thing, as soon as they say you cannot make this and burn it, you really go, oh, why? What does it smell like? I really want to know. Except the next bit says God will smite you, so I'm not that keen to find out. I'll wait. I'll find out later. But it is made partly with frankincense, which is interesting. And so this incense, this special incense, is burned on the altar, and it in part represents the idea of prayers rising to heaven. They are a sweet smell in God's nostrils. And this is the only thing that this altar is used for. It can only be used by the priests, only for burning this incense as a symbolism of prayer. And so you can see why we very quickly connect the idea of frankincense and the priesthood. It is the incense used by the priests within priestly worship in the tabernacle. Fair enough. But frankincense has a second purpose as well. Now, for this, we need to just shuffle one book over into the book of Leviticus, which again is not always fascinating reading, but in bits and pieces, some of it is incredible. And if you were to look in chapter 2, or chapter 6, or chapter 424, then you would find that frankincense is used within the offering process, quite specifically to anoint a sacrifice before it is sacrificed, before it is burnt or waved or whatever. Part of the preparation for a sacrifice is that frankincense is put on it. See, I think what the Magi and what their gift tells us here is not just that Jesus is a priest, but that Jesus is a sacrifice. In fact, I think we can go a step further. Because as I was looking at this, I noticed that there is one of the offerings where it says, do not put frankincense on this offering. Put it on this, put it on the burnt offering, and put it on this, the wave offering, and this, the something else offering. You can put it on all of those, that's fine. Don't put it on this one. And that bothered me at first because I thought, oh, pants, that's going to massively undermine my point, and I can't, in good conscience stand up and say frankincense is all about the sacrifice, if in fact it's saying don't put it on some of them. So I thought I looked at it and thought, why? Why is there not frankincense on this offering? What's special about this offering? And the offering that you cannot put frankincense on is the sin offering. Now the sin offering, as the name implies, is an offering brought by someone who has sinned in order to atone for that sin. The thing about Jesus, he doesn't sin. He is without sin. The one offering that Jesus could not bring to the temple is the sin offering. And that's the one that you don't put frankincense on. Now maybe you might be sitting there thinking, Dave, you're reading too much into this. Maybe. But I like that. I like that detail of the one thing that Jesus could never bring as an offering is the one thing that frankincense does not connect to. Because Jesus is not that sacrifice. Except he is. He will become that. But I think the frankincense points us towards he is without sin, and yet he is the sacrifice. So Jesus is our priest, our intercessor before God. But more than that, the frankincense reminds us that he not only intercedes for us, he gives himself as the sacrifice. Jesus himself is the offering that restores us to relationship with God. And then we have the third gift, the myrrh. And this is perhaps the most pessimistic verse of a fairly pessimistic carol, where myrrh reminds us of gathering gloom, sorrowing, sighing, bleeding, dying, sealed in the stone-cold tomb. Happy birthday, Jesus! Bless that third magi. And again, to say, oh, but myrrh is about death, that's entirely fair. That's a fair way of looking at it. That's not a wrong thing, because myrrh is used to anoint dead bodies. In fact, in John 19:39, that's exactly what happened. Jesus is taken down from the cross, and Joseph of Arimathea wants to anoint him with spices and all that kind of stuff, and they do, and they put him into the tomb. That's entirely fair. But, because it wouldn't be my third point if there wasn't going to be a but at that point, it's not the only place that we find myrrh in the Bible. What is surprising is where myrrh pops up, because it's mostly in the Song of Songs. Song of Songs are one of my favourite books of the Bible, because you always get to say to people, small children were not allowed to read this because it's too naughty, which is an excellent way of motivating your young people to go and read a book of the Bible. What? I can't read it? Yeah, well, no, not really. Okay, I'm going to then. Works every time. But the thing is, this is odd, because Song of Songs is not about death at all. In fact, all of the references in the Old Testament to myrrh are not connected to death. It's a valid reading, because in the New Testament, that's what we see it being used for. It's used to anoint dead bodies. It's also mixed with vinegar and waved at Jesus as a painkiller while he's on the cross, and he refuses it. But elsewhere in the Old Testament, myrrh is this beautiful romantic perfume. If we go to the book of Esther, we discover that in the year of preparation, 6 months of Esther preparing to meet King Xerxes was being anointed with myrrh. In Psalm 45, we read about myrrh. And Psalm 45 is a psalm to be read at weddings. In Proverbs 7, slightly less salubriously, you find it on the bed of the woman who is trying to commit adultery, the one that we're told to avoid. And then songs. It pops up half a dozen times in songs, and each time it's a symbol of infatuation or romance or passion or love. It's rubbed on robes, it's left on beds, it's worn in sachets around the neck. It's a way of saying, this symbolizes my lover, this symbolizes the affection and the love that I have for him or for her. And that kind of clashes with our normal reading of myrrh is about death. And I think, once again, we have to hold two meanings at the same time. Because the death thing is true and it's important. Jesus comes and lives amongst us in order, in the end, to die for us. We can't get away from that, and we don't want to. That is part of the purpose of Jesus. But I think myrrh also speaks to us of why he does this. Jesus does all that because he loves us. He loves us, the church, the congregation, the community, the whole world. he loves us. And without that love, I think his death is lessened because it becomes a transaction. It becomes a simple settling of debts. I mean, massively generous, don't get me wrong, it would be an incredibly generous thing to do, even on that level of just a transactional thing. But to paraphrase what Paul says in Corinthians, even if one gives everything without love, it is nothing. But with love, with the kind of passionate, all-encompassing love that Myrrh speaks of, we're reminded that Jesus' death is about relationship. It's about restoration. It's about drawing us back into this unending, intimate dance that is knowing God and being known by him. So as this Christmas season draws to a close this week, it is good to remember that Jesus is indeed our King and our priest, and that he died for us. But let's also remember that Jesus, in his purity and his holiness, he chose to become the perfect sacrifice and gave his life for us as an act of complete and utter love. And that, I think, is worth celebrating. Lord, we thank you that even in your holiness, you chose to become a sacrifice because of your love for us. Lord, help us not to miss that, not to put your love aside or to overlook it, but to hold it at the center of all that we do. Lord, help us to live in ways that show our love for you and reflect your love for the people around us. But most of all, Lord, just help us to be in your presence. And as we gather in whatever way that we can, help us to know your love for each one of us. Amen.